As stated earlier, perception is up to the individual and can be considered as a way of regarding, understanding, or interpreting something. In other words, perception is a mental impression of some stimuli we have received. So looking at this picture, what did you pick up first in this image? A woman walking across a cobblestone square? Or did you see a face? When we are first exposed to a stimuli, such as a sound, that specific sensory organ, such as your ear, is activated and the process of perception begins. To get consumers to pay attention to a commercial, for instance, we must first expose them to the information. But mere exposure is not sufficient. We must thus also have consumers actively pay attention to our message. Viewers are selective in what information they choose to process. As such, advertisers have a great deal of interest in getting consumers to not only allow a stimuli to reach them, but also to gain some level of engagement. This selective exposure, which is the active choice a consumer makes to permit a stimuli to penetrate the shield that we have constructed that limits the amount of information we receive. The more consumers block a marketing stimuli, the less effective the advertising dollars that are being spent on commercials. This requires marketers to spend more money reaching the same number of consumers. This is why the price of a Super Bowl ad is so high. For example, a 30-second spot for this year's upcoming game will be over $5 million. But as Super Bowl ads are being viewed by over 100 million people, who are just as involved with the commercials as they are for the game, this is typically money well spent. Any discussion of exposure, though, requires us to look at sensory thresholds, which is the level of strength that a stimuli must have to be detected. No matter what, there are some stimuli that will never be processed. The text gives you the example of a dog whistle. And because a dog has a vastly different hearing range than do us humans, they are able to pick up the sound where we can't. The same can also be said for a range of sounds that can be heard by younger people when compared to those a bit older. This slide basically shows the least amount of stimuli that a person can detect, which is referred to as the absolute threshold. And it's important for brands to consider when designing marketing stimuli. On the opposite side of this is the differential threshold, which is what differences are necessary for us to even detect a change. For example, with the absolute threshold, our sight, the absolute minimum that can be detected 50% of the time is a candle flame 30 miles away on a clear night. Hearing is like hearing a watch tick 20 feet away. Smell, smelling a drop of perfume in a 3-room house. And taste, which is tasting 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved into 2 gallons of water. Touch is an interesting aspect because the tactile experience is one of the things that really make people want to buy products oftentimes. We want to touch, we want to feel it, we want to see how it's going to be in our hand before we will make that plunge. And for touch, the absolute threshold is feeling a bee's wings falling a distance of 1 centimeter onto your cheek. It's very light. Relatedly, the concept of just noticeable difference, or JND, is the minimum difference that we can detect between 2 stimuli. And marketers use this concept often, especially when altering the quantity of a product or changing a price. Oftentimes, the volume of a package will change while the size of the package itself remains relatively the same. In these instances, it is likely the marketer's intention that the consumer not notice the difference. Look at this example up here in this slide. The candy manufacturers reduce the amount of product each package contains, likely leaving the price around the same. Of course, there will always be some people that pick up the difference, such as candy aficionados. They'll notice it right away, but the average consumer, they will not. And in some cases, such as the example with the Star-Kissed tuna, Even if you do change the package, we're likely not to notice unless they're stacked side by side from each other, because it's just not that big of a change. Other things to look at. Look at the change of packaging from Coke. That was just a minor change. A lot of people picked it up. Some didn't even notice it. And what about a price change? $24.49 versus $24.99? We may not even notice it because it's such a small difference. One other thing that can happen, for example, if you look at the Skippy example here, the net weight of the product changed completely, but the package size is exactly the same. How do they do it? Well, look at the other picture. They put an indent in the bottom of the package, which made the package actually the inside smaller, but the package on the outside stay the same. But one of the things that they found is that, for example, on the opposite end of this, M&M Mars, after a year-long study, they found that an increase in the size of their candy bar resulted in a 20 to 30% increase in the number of units being sold. So you can use this both ways. A lot of our understanding in this area comes from the work of Ernst Weber, a 19th century psychophysicist who was conducting research in this area and contended that the aspect of just noticeable difference varies with the level of the stimulus. As the absolute level of a stimulus increases, so does the size of the J and D that is needed. And no, that's a little hard to understand. Let's see if we can put it into this context. We'll use the rule of thumb that retailers use. What they're basically stating is that for a markdown, a retailer for a markdown must be at least 20% before a consumer is even going to recognize that a markdown has taken place. So, for example, if we reduce the price of a $10 item by $2, which is 20%, this is going to be picked up much easier than if we decrease a $50 item by $5, which is only a 10% increase. So as the stimulus increases, the price of the product, let's say, increases, the markdown that we're going to have to take is going to have to be larger and larger on an absolute level, although relatively the same size from a percentage level. Hope that made sense. As stated earlier, the absolute threshold is the lowest level that can be detected half of the time. A related, albeit more controversial area is subliminal perception, which is a stimulus that is below the level of a consumer's awareness. This controversial idea of subliminal advertising was first highlighted in 1957, when audiences at a movie theater in New Jersey were supposedly exposed to messages presented ever so briefly on the screen that said, "Drink Coca-Cola" and "Eat popcorn." The messages were superimposed on the movie and presented so quickly that the audience couldn't consciously realize that they had appeared. And although no evidence has been presented, the marketing firm that created the messages claimed sales of popcorn and Coke increased dramatically during these showings of the movie. There's been extensive research on this topic ever since then, but no evidence has ever been found to this effect. However, our subconscious mind does have influence over our thoughts, ideas, and emotions. To see the effect that the subconscious has, have you ever had trouble remembering something and it's only after you consciously stop thinking about it that the answer will pop into your head? While you may have consciously stopped trying to remember, your subconscious was continued to process the request until it came up with the answer for you. So there is a little something to it. Oftentimes, marketers will seek to engage your subliminal processing power to get you to notice something that is presented in plain sight. For example, if you look at the FedEx logo, specifically between the E and the X, you should see a right pointing arrow. Or look at the center of the Baskin-Robbins logo. The capital BR is also telling you how many flavors they have, 31. But what about the Pittsburgh Zoo? Do you see a gorilla and lioness facing each other? As for the Skittle packaging, this could be a completely unintentional design, or the designer having a little fun with the red Skittle being strategically placed next to Explosion. There have been many examples, such as the one that's in the Skittles package. Disney films have seen numerous incidents where the animators took liberties with certain parts of the film they were working on. The Lion King and The Little Mermaid are two examples that come to mind. When I was a boy, each month I looked forward to reading Highlights for Children, a magazine for kids that is still around today. When it came out each month, I would go over to my friend Ricky's house, because his parents cared about his education, so I could read the magazine. One of the things I enjoyed the most was the feature, such as this one, where you had to find the 24 differences between two seemingly identical images. Many differences are easy to spot, but there are always one or two that require you to put forth a bit of effort. If you want, go ahead and pause the video and see if you can find all 24. But keep in mind, the next slide, I'm going to try to show you all the solution to it. Let's see if I can remember how to do these. So here's the solution. Why were some so easy for us to find, while others took a while to identify? Part of it is due to our focus, of course, but other differences were harder to detect because the differences were subtle and may be just at or barely above our threshold for detection. As we discussed earlier in the section about J&D, marketers understand that we are often unable to detect minute changes, and at times have used this knowledge to impart changes on the quantity we receive from a product. They're generally hoping we don't notice. This feeds into our sensory threshold, which is the point in which a stimuli can make a conscious impact on our awareness. So here's another example from Colgate. Can you pick this one up? Wait, whose hand is that on his shoulder? This one should have been much easier for you given that you've already been exposed to a similar image. In lecture 3.3, we're going to discuss the second stage of perception, which is intention.